This is the first in the series of AP Review PowerPoints about 10 things that you should know, first topic being environmental ethics and environmental history. So to start out with, let's look at how you see the world. These are environmental worldviews. The first one we come to is planetary management. The idea here is that we are above nature and that what we are going to do is meet our needs and look at the earth as simply a tool in doing that. The second worldview is stewardship, and in stewardship we have, it says, an ethical responsibility to be managers of the earth. And so looking at it that way, yes, we will still use the earth, but we shouldn't be running out of any resources because us being good managers means that the earth stays around indefinitely. And the last worldview is environmental wisdom, where we are just one more species in nature. All of us are here together. We shouldn't waste anything. We should be earth sustaining. And I would say most people probably fall into the stewardship category. The environmental wisdom on here looks pretty simple, but in reality it goes a stretch beyond what most people are prepared to do. It means recycling everything. It means bringing your own reusable forks and plates to a picnic where you might be using plastic. And so again, environmental wisdom goes a step beyond just stewardship, where a lot of us, I think, fall into stewardship. So again, those are your worldviews, and it just depends on what you personally think. None of them is bad, none of them is good, because it is your own personal view. Now, if we're going to look at the worldviews in a continuum, you see environmental wisdom being very, very outwardly focused, biosphere or earth-centered. Stewardship is next, then planetary management. And as you keep moving inside into the rings, you see somebody who is just completely self-centered in the very, very center. One of the words to focus on there, right centered, is anthropocentric. I know a lot of people had a question on the practice AP exam about anthropogenic, but anthro is always going to be human, and so, yeah, anthropogenic, that's what it was. But always remember the human, and so anthropocentric is a human-centered view. So it's more than just yourself, but it doesn't go far beyond that. And so again, it's just another way to look at this as a continuum. And again, another way to look at it, levels of ethical concern. You start with yourself, your family, community, and friends, moving up and up and up. So again, I don't think most people are really so far as to say that they are completely biosphere ethically concerned, because most of us maybe stop at the individuals of the animal species. Maybe not all animal species should exist. Maybe you don't mind killing mosquitoes or ants. And so you really have to think about where you lie on this continuum, because sometimes you don't care about ants, but you do care about a rainforest. And so it's not a perfect science, but it just gives you a way to view it. So what should we do to live more sustainably? That's ultimately the purpose of environmental science, is to teach us how to be better stewards. And so I won't go through all of them. You guys can pretty much figure them out by common sense. Don't waste things, protect the earth. Climate change is a big one on here down towards the middle. But again, we just need to be smarter about what we do so that we don't degrade the natural capital that we have and the ecosystem services that the earth is giving us. The sustainability dozen. This is things that you could do easily, maybe not so easily, but things that you personally can do in order to help protect the earth. So starting from the top and moving around clockwise, insulate your house and plug leaks, reduce meat consumption, buy locally grown, buy or grow organic food, don't use pesticides, walk, bike, carpool, mass transit, drive an energy efficient vehicle, reduce the amount you use your vehicle, use water saving appliances, reduce, reuse, recycle, use energy efficient heating and cooling, and use renewable energy, especially wind and direct solar. So again, some of these things you don't have as much control over now as a teenager that you will later on, but you can see a lot of it revolves around food, and then the other part of it revolves around energy. And so there really are a lot of things that you can do to start simple, reducing your footprint, the image in the center. Okay, now we're going to go through a little bit of the history. Thomas Malthus, remember, said that the human population was growing exponentially, but food supply was not. And so he said that eventually we would overshoot the food supply and end up with a food shortage, which would lead us to a population collapse. And remember, he was wrong because we found a way to make food production increase exponentially. The question, though, is for how long? Is there eventually going to be a place where we do overshoot our ability of the planet to produce food? And now we're more concerned with what about the quality of that food? Yes, we can make lots of genetically modified corn, but is that the best way to feed ourselves to be healthy? Thoreau, what you should know about Thoreau, he was an author. He was definitely in the forefront of the American environmentalist movement in terms of his writings really reflected peaceful views on nature and being a part of nature. Obviously, most famously known for his writings on evading taxes and on peaceful civil protest. But Walden, A Walk in the Woods is, or I'm sorry, Walden, A Life in the Woods is definitely one of his other very, very famous works. And you can see in the bottom right picture the replica of the size of the house that he built for himself when he was living there on Walden Pond. So he wasn't talking about a huge space, but he ate from the earth and he did his best to live sustainably. Yellowstone National Park, big thing here, 1872, we get our first national park. The recognition that land should be set aside so that we could preserve some of America's great beauties and national treasures. And so Yellowstone's still one of the most enormous parks that we have, set aside by Ulysses S. Grant. And yeah, I think that's about it. London fog in 1880. This is our first recorded massive pollution events, even though pollution events were going on in England since the 15th century. But this one, obviously, later on, closer to industrialization, we can see the gray air smoke. So we know that that has to do with particulates, especially from coal. Sierra Club, founded in 1892 by John Muir. This is America's first, and it is still going, our first environmental club. They really are a preservationist society, so they don't believe that we should be influencing the earth really at all. And one of the big battles that John Muir got into was over the Hetch Hetchy Dam, and that's over by Yosemite. And he did not want the dam to be built because it would interfere with the flow of the river, and the Department of the Interior eventually won out, and John Muir lost. But he was friends with presidents. He was friends with President Roosevelt, and the first Roosevelt, that is. And so he did have quite a bit of say in the direction that environmental movements were going to go in the golden age of conservation. Lacey Act of 1900, remember this is our first environmental law. It really had nothing so much to do with the environment as much as protecting the trade in feathers. And so it was an economic law, but it had the added virtue of protecting the water birds, especially in Florida. And so again, environmental law as it protected the birds from being illegally taken, killed, and sold, but that wasn't the main purpose. Theodore Roosevelt, again, the first Roosevelt, he was an avid conservationist. Again, not a preservationist like Muir. Instead, what Roosevelt really wanted to do was protect wilderness so that we could be stewards. So again, you're looking at that stewardship worldview. He was an avid hunter, and you can see the picture in the top right there, even going to Africa, killing an elephant, which wasn't thought of to be, again, anything massively wrong back then because we didn't know that the population numbers would eventually decline so much. But he was, again, an avid sportsman, and he wanted America to protect its hunting lands. So again, conservation, not preservation. You end up with a lot of the same results, protection. And I like the quote, "A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself." He spoke a lot about protecting the Grand Canyon, protecting Yosemite and Yellowstone, and again, just a very, very progressive president in terms of the environmental movement, and his presidency was known as the Golden Age of Conservation. One of the things during his presidency is appointing Paul Krogel to the first wildlife refuge created, Pelican Island, in 1903. This was the crazy guy who just sat there with a gun trying to kill anybody who wanted to shoot the pelicans. The white pelicans are pretty rare. You can see in the picture, and the brown pelicans are more common in Florida. But this little island is a nice nesting ground for those pelicans, and people were coming and trying to shoot them as they nested. And so Paul really wanted to protect those pelicans. Got paid $1 a year to do it. Forest Service was established in 1905, again under Roosevelt, and he picked Pinchot as his first head of the Forest Service. Remember that the Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, and that really underlines what it was that Pinchot differed from Muir. Pinchot was definitely of the mindset that the forests were a commodity that should be cut down. So Department of Agriculture really helps you remember that the point of the Forest Service is to cut down the trees, not to keep forests nice and lush for hikers. It really is supposed to be a crop. So Department of Agriculture, the trees are a crop of the U.S. Forest Service. Sand County Almanac, 1949. We've got Aldo Leopold here, who is considered to be the father of ecology. His ideas that he puts forth here during his retirement years start off that notion that we are tied to the earth. So his quote, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." So he's living on a farm in retirement, and he's looking at what's going on. Again, this is post-Dust Bowl too. And he's seeing that we are really tied to the success of the land, and the land is tied to the success of us. And so that starts this idea of ecology and ecosystems, that we are all tied together. So we're not talking about a very old science when we talk about ecology, and then later on, environmental science. Silent Spring, 1962, obviously Rachel Carson, the famous marine biologist. She wrote plenty of other books about marine ecosystems, but this is the book that got the public really thinking about what we were doing with toxins, especially DDT, in the environment. And so she made the links between the birds and the pesticides and made people understand that those things that we were spraying out of convenience were having a harmful impact. So she is considered to be the mother of environmental science, whereas Leopold is considered to be the father of ecology. After Rachel Carson's book gets into the public eye, it really causes a stir, and the 60s begin to be very, very a time of a lot of movement towards environmental concerns and issues, paving the way for 1970 to be a record year in terms of environmental legislation. So in 1968, Paul Ehrlich was one of those people following in Rachel Carson's footsteps, and he's looking at the idea of Malthus again and saying, look, we have way too many people, and we are going to be causing problems for ourselves, and at some point, this population bomb is going to go off, and it is going to affect our lives. It's going to affect our children. We're going to have starvation. We're going to have mass problems. And a lot of people have since called him sort of silly for overstating the problem, but he will defend to this day that there is a concern to be had. The thing is that our population continues to grow. In 1968, I don't know exactly what the population was, but I would guess it was around 4 or 5 billion, not the 7 billion we have now. Tragedy of the Commons, 1968, by Garrett Hardin. This is one of my favorites. He talks about agriculture in terms of the really the Bureau of Land Management, which is in control of the rangelands. And so he's really talking about cows grazing, other animals that would graze on these pastures out west. And what he is saying is that when you don't have any one person in control of that land, everybody shares it, everybody uses it, and everybody degrades it because everyone is simply thinking themselves. and that is the tragedy of a common space. And we can make now the generalization of that tragedy to things like the air, to things like the global oceans and the fishery stocks. But he starts out with that idea and puts it in the terms of what was going on with agriculture in the American West. So again, we're setting the stage for some really big movement in the environmental front, first of which being the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in 1969. Biggest thing you need to remember is that to do NEPA, to make sure that you can build or to make sure that you can do um, any sort of federal improvement, you have to make sure that the ecological impacts are mitigated or negligible. And so that's a huge thing. And this is where you have to do an EIS, an environmental impact statement. It's not written on there, but those two terms should go hand in hand in your mind. NEPA and the EIS. So 1970, we got a lot of things going on. We've got the first Earth Day, which was organized as an environmental teach-in. They'd had a bunch of sit-ins back in the 60s, and this was supposed to be a teach-in. College professors talking about the problems with the environment. So it was very much a college campus-oriented, very young movement, but the first one, again, being in 1970. And then we also had that year, the EPA was established by Richard Nixon, and the Clean Air Act was passed, again by Nixon. So after Roosevelt, we consider Nixon to be the next most environmental president. The times were just right for this to happen. Everybody agreed it wasn't a Democratic or a Republican initiative. Everybody wanted the environment cleaned up, and it has worked. We actually have a cleaner environment than we had in the 60s. So everything done for the protection of the environment really has had a lasting impact. Clean Water Act came along in 1977, and it again has had a great impact in decreasing the number of streams and lakes that are considered to be unusable, unfishable, unswimmable. They have different designations based on the chemical content and the fecal coliform content. And so the Clean Water Act has had a very good effect on that. Montreal Protocol, 1987. Remember Montreal in Canada? We like them, we agree with them. So this one is the ozone layer. Everybody got together and said we've got to do something to stop emitting CFCs. And so what we see here is that in 1990, we outlawed the production of CFCs. And so those dropped drastically. But what we know now is that it takes those CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, in things like aerosols and air conditioners, takes them 20 to 30 years before they're up in the stratosphere where they destroy the ozone layer. And from that point, the CFC molecules will stay in the stratosphere and circulate, killing off molecules of ozone continually for another period of time, 20, 30 years. So we don't expect that the ozone will recover terribly quickly. It has now been, I don't know, y'all can count how many years, but it's been quite a number of years since the Montreal Protocol, and we have started to see the peak of the hole in the ozone layer. And so hopefully we're on our way to ozone recovery now. But you can see from the picture that it does stretch towards Australia, it stretches towards South America. So at different times of the year, you have legitimate holes in the ozone layer, meaning you're not getting any UVB or UVC protection. And we never get any UVA protection from the ozone, but that one is the least of the three concerns. Kyoto Protocol. For the Kyoto Protocol, you have Japan, and so remember here, we didn't agree with Japan. Remember, we bombed them, so makes sense. The other country on the list that didn't actually ratify was Australia. Now, important to note, we did sign it, but we didn't ratify it. So we sent, I think we actually sent Gore over, I don't think we sent Clinton over, but we went to Kyoto with the express reason of signing this protocol. We wanted to agree with it. but coming back, we couldn't get our House and our Senate on board with it. Now, since then, a lot of Americans have changed their mind and think that we should be part of it, but we still aren't. Some states have decided that they would go ahead and adopt those policies on their own. If you see the gray states there, or the gray countries, there's no position there. The yellow, it says they have signed, but the ratification is pending. And this is the best graphic I could find from 2005. So obviously some years have passed since then, but I'll be honest, not much has changed. If the United States isn't going to play, then that makes a huge impact in whether we can reduce climate change. Remember also the US decided not to join because you've got China, India, and Brazil with special provisions for pollution, and so that really seemed a little bit unfair. So then later on, that was the reason for not ratifying when we had a House and Senate switch, is there was still that concern for the president about it not being the right thing for the American economy. So you really have a hard time here with this decision saying who's right and who's wrong, because it is an economic burden, but we also have a potential larger economic burden if global warming continues. And that is the end of the Part 1 slideshow.